Grace stood on the edge of the dusty train platform, clutching a worn bag that held everything she owned. The hem of her dress was frayed, her boots pinched her toes, and her hat was too big for her head, slipping down over her eyes with every dry gust of wind. She kept pushing it back up, trying to look composed, though her stomach churned and her throat burned from the long ride west. Her back ached, and her heart was sore in a way she couldn't explain. She wasn't even sure she remembered what love looked like anymore. All she had was a letter and a promise. Nathaniel Harper, age 35, owner of a ranch outside of Redstone, had written that he was looking for a wife. Not just a woman to warm his bed, but someone to share in the hard work of running land. Someone with strong arms and a strong heart. Grace had replied with honesty, more than she probably should have. She told him about the family who'd cast her out, about the man back in St. Louis who'd taken everything and left her with nothing but a bad name and a bruised soul. She didn't sugarcoat a thing. Somehow, Nathaniel still said yes. Said he wanted a woman who could weather a storm, not a porcelain doll who'd break at the first thunderclap. But when she stepped off that train into the baked, raw air of Redstone, no one was waiting. She waited on that platform until the sun started to dip low behind the hills, and the last of the passengers had gone. The station master, an old man with rheumy eyes, finally asked her who she was looking for. She told him. He frowned, took off his hat, scratched at his scalp. "Ma'am, far as I know, Nathaniel Harper ain't been in town for near 6 months. Folks say he sold off his land, went north. Some say he died in a mining camp." Grace blinked hard. She opened her mouth, closed it again. She felt her knees weaken, but didn't let them give out. The letter in her pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Her chest clenched, not just from disappointment, but shame. She told him everything, poured herself onto that paper like it might be the last chance she'd ever get to be seen. The station master tried to help in his own way. Told her about a boarding house 2 streets over, cheap rates, nice widow who ran the place. Grace thanked him and walked away, holding her bag tighter. It wasn't the first time she'd been left behind. The boarding house was clean, but that didn't stop the whispers. The other boarders watched her with sideways glances, noting her plain clothes and stiff posture. Some of the women laughed behind closed doors. "Another fool chasing a man who never wanted her," she heard one say as she passed the hallway. Grace didn't cry. She'd done all her crying back in St. Louis, when Thomas Rivers promised her love and gave her only lies. That had been 3 years ago. She'd worked in a textile mill after that, slept in a room with 6 other women, lived off stale bread and watered-down soup. The man she'd fallen for had walked away with her mother's brooch, the rent money, and her dignity. And now, it seemed, history had repeated itself. Still, she went into town the next day with her chin up. She asked around about work, any kind. Most of the answers were no, or worse. Offers made by men who looked her over with the same cold eyes Thomas had. The kind of eyes that didn't care who you were, only what they could get from you. By the 3rd day, she had only a few coins left, barely enough for 2 nights and a meal. She went back to the boarding house late and quiet, hoping not to catch anyone's eye. But laughter spilled from the parlor as she passed. Someone had left a newspaper open on the table, and as she turned to look, she caught sight of her own name. Her letter, or at least parts of it. Someone had published her words, mocking them in a column titled "Fool's Gold," a mail-order mess. It was written like a joke, twisting her pain into something to be laughed at. She stood there, frozen, her hands shaking. The girls in the parlor roared with laughter, not even realizing she was there. She walked back to her room and didn't come out for a full day. But the town wasn't done with her yet. The next morning, she found a note slipped under her door. A scrap of paper, torn and dirty, but the handwriting was neat. "Not all men here are cowards or liars. Come to Harper's Ridge at dusk. Bring nothing you can't carry on foot. No name, no explanation." She held the note like it might catch fire. Her first thought was that it was another trick, some cruel prank. Maybe one of the men who'd stared too long in the saloon, or someone hoping for a laugh. But something about the message stuck in her gut, quiet, steady, sure. It wasn't flowery or sweet. It wasn't asking her to beg or plead or prove herself. It just said come, and that's what scared her the most. Still, when the sun sank behind the rooftops and shadows stretched long across the road, she slipped out the back of the boarding house, bag in hand. She followed the dirt trail north, past the edge of town, toward the ridge that bore Nathaniel's name. It was slow going. Her boots weren't made for this terrain, and her dress caught on every bush and branch. But she kept going. At the top of the ridge, where the land flattened out into a wide stretch of golden grass, a man stood beside a wagon. He wasn't tall, not like Nathaniel said he was. He wasn't clean-shaven either, and his coat was patched at the elbows. But his face was open, lined kind, like someone who'd seen bad days and still remembered how to be gentle. "Your Grace," he said. Not a question, a statement. She nodded. "I'm Silas," he said. "I work Harper's ranch," before he ran off. He left owing a lot of folks money. Said he was sending for a bride, but no one believed he'd actually do it. Grace swallowed. "Why are you here?" "Because I read that newspaper," he said quietly. And I didn't laugh. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The wind moved through the grass like water, and the sky above them stretched out wide and endless. Grace's eyes stung, but she didn't let the tears fall. "Not yet. I don't have much," Silas said finally. "Just a shack I built myself and some old cattle. But if you want something real, something built slow and steady, you can come with me. No promises, except that I won't lie to you." Grace didn't answer right away. Her whole life had been filled with people who said the right things and did the wrong ones. Men like Thomas, letters like Nathaniel's, smiles that meant nothing. But something about the way Silas looked at her made it hard to turn away. She stood still, heart thudding, unsure if she was stepping into another mistake or the first step towards something she thought she'd never have again. The wind carried dust around her boots, and the stars began to blink alive overhead. She took one breath, then another, then took a step forward. Grace didn't speak much on the journey to Silas's land. The wagon creaked over rocky ground, the old mule pulling with steady determination. Silas didn't fill the silence with talk, which she appreciated more than she could say. He glanced at her now and then, checking that she was still there, but he didn't ask questions. That made her trust him a little, just enough to stay in the wagon instead of jumping off and walking back to town. By the time they reached his homestead, the moon had risen high and silver over the hills. The place was small, just one room, wood and stone fitted tight against the weather. A lean-to barn sat nearby, and 3 thin cows stood in a fenced corral. There was no grand gate or big house like she'd once imagined in Nathaniel's letters. But there was a fire lit in the hearth and a quilt spread on the cot. Silas handed her a tin cup of warm coffee and said, "You can have the bed. I'll take the floor." She sipped the drink and nodded. She didn't thank him, not because she wasn't grateful, but because she didn't know how to put the right kind of thanks into words yet. In the days that followed, she learned to work beside him. He taught her how to mend fence posts, how to move cattle slow so they didn't spook. She found out his hands were rough from years of ranch work, and his knees clicked when he stood. He walked with a slight limp that got worse in the cold, but he never complained. He told her he'd fought in the war, and when he came home, everything he'd known was gone. He didn't say more than that, and she didn't push. The quiet rhythm of work settled into something almost like peace. But peace never lasts long out here. It started with a visitor. A man rode up one morning, his boots dusty, hat pulled low, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked at Grace too long and shook Silas's hand with a grip that lingered too hard. His name was Elijah Beck, a rancher from the Southern Valley. Said he'd known Nathaniel Harper. Said he'd been by Silas's place before, once or twice. Grace kept her eyes down, but her skin prickled. Beck had wealth. That much was clear. His boots were polished, his coat fine wool, his horse a strong, well-fed beast. He looked like the kind of man who could afford to make people disappear if they crossed him. He talked smooth, polite too polite, kept glancing at Grace as he asked Silas questions that didn't sound like questions at all. "You keepin' help now, Silas?" he said with a smirk. "Didn't think you were the marrying type." Silas's face didn't change, but Grace felt the tension in his stillness. "She's not help. She's my guest." "Is that so?" Beck said, eyes still on her. "Funny, I heard the whole town talking. That letter of hers been passed around more than a church collection plate. Real tender stuff. Almost brought a tear to my eye." Grace's cheeks burned. She didn't answer. Silas stepped forward, not threatening, but firm. "You got something you need, Beck." "Just visiting," he said, all honey again. "Heard Harper owed you some money. Just wondering if you were still holding his ghosts." He tipped his hat and rode off, dust rising behind him. After he was gone, Grace stood on the porch, arms crossed. Who was he really? Silas ran a hand through his hair, looking out toward the trail Beck had vanished down. "Elijah Beck owns most of the land south of here. He used to want Harper's place. They had bad blood. Harper took out a loan he couldn't pay back. Beck expected the land as payment. And you got it instead." Silas didn't answer. That was when Grace started noticing things. Little things, but they added up. A locked drawer in the shed that Silas never opened when she was around. A burn mark on one of the fence posts, as if something had caught fire recently. A name carved into the wood beside the barn. Clara, scratched in deep and crossed out. Then there was the woman at the general store in town. Grace had gone alone one afternoon to pick up some supplies. The woman behind the counter was young, dark-haired, with red ribbons on her sleeves and sharp eyes. She looked at Grace, then at the list Silas had written for her. "You're staying with Silas?" she asked. Grace nodded. The girl narrowed her eyes. "Did he tell you about Clara?" Grace felt her spine go rigid. "No." The girl leaned closer. "She lived with him last winter. Said she was his cousin, but folks didn't believe that. She disappeared after the thaw. No goodbye. No wagon. Just gone." Grace didn't buy gossip easily. She'd been on the wrong side of too many whispers. But this felt different. Clara, the name in the barn. The silence in Silas's eyes when he talked about the past. When she got back to the homestead, she asked him. Simple, direct. "Who was Clara?" Silas froze mid-step. Then he turned away, rubbing the back of his neck. "She was someone I try to help. Like you. She was running from something worse than hunger. But I couldn't save her." "Why not?" He looked at her then, really looked. His eyes were tired. "Because she didn't want saving, and I was too proud to see it." He didn't say more. She didn't ask, but something had shifted. That night, Grace went outside and sat on the porch long after the fire had burned low. She stared at the stars, wondering how many people had vanished under that sky, and how many secrets the land kept buried. She thought of Beck's words, of Clara's name, of the cold silence in Silas's voice when he said he'd fought in the war and come back to nothing. She wasn't sure who to trust anymore. But then, she'd never been sure. 3 days later, the second visitor came. This one was different. Younger, nervous. Barely more than a boy, with sunburned skin and a rifle too big for his frame. He rode up in the middle of breakfast, hair wild and eyes darting. Said his name was Jonah Briggs, from a farm 2 valleys over. He asked for water, then asked if Silas still had the rifle Harper left behind. Grace caught the tension in Silas's jaw again. "Don't know what you mean," Silas said. "Don't lie to me," the boy snapped. "You were there when they came. When they took my brother. You know what that rifle meant." Silas stood, slow and quiet. "I don't owe you an explanation." Jonah's eyes went to Grace. "He didn't tell you, did he? Harper wasn't just some rancher. He was part of something. A group of men who dealt in stolen cattle, sometimes people. My brother found out. They made him disappear." He turned to Silas. "You were Harper's right hand. You knew what he did." Silas didn't move. "I didn't agree with him. That's why I stayed behind. That's why I tried to do better. That's why Clara left. Or did she find out too much?" That was the first time Grace saw real fear in Silas's eyes. Jonah spit in the dirt. You think you can bury the past, but it's clawing its way up, and it's going to bite. He rode off before either of them could stop him. Grace didn't speak that night. She sat by the fire while Silas sharpened a blade he never used. The sound of metal on stone was steady, rhythmic, like a ticking clock. Finally, she said, "Is any of this true?" Silas looked up. "What part?" "All of it." He stared into the flames. "Some of it. Enough of it." She nodded once. That was the worst kind of answer. Honest enough to hurt, vague enough to hide. But she didn't leave, because even if everything Jonah and Beck said was true, there was still something different about the way Silas looked at her. He hadn't tried to charm her, hadn't touched her without asking, hadn't made promises he couldn't keep. Maybe he was running from something, same as her. Maybe that's what made her stay. Still, in her chest, the questions kept burning. Why did Nathaniel write to her, knowing he'd never be there? Why did Silas take her in, knowing the whole town was watching? And most of all, what happened to Clara? The answers were coming. Grace could feel them, creeping up through the silence like roots under soil. The past didn't stay buried long in Redstone, not when so many people had their hands on the shovel. The morning Grace found the blood on the porch. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, and the air stung cold against her skin. It was only a smear, not fresh, but thick and dark along the edge of the step, just enough to twist her stomach into a knot. She knelt to touch it, her fingers shaking, and looked out across the land. The cattle were grazing quiet in the field. The barn stood still. Silas's rifle was gone from the peg inside the door. She didn't panic. Not yet. Instead, she sat and waited, staring out at the long, empty road that led down to Redstone, thinking about all the things she hadn't wanted to see. Silas had lied. That much was clear. Not just once, not just in pieces. He'd built a careful story, left out all the parts that mattered, the ones that could hurt. Grace had let herself believe in the silence between his words. She thought maybe silence meant safety. But now she understood that silence was a choice too, a way of keeping her blind. He came back after dark, coat wet, hands covered in dirt. She asked nothing. He said nothing. Just sat by the fire and drank coffee like he hadn't vanished for hours. When she finally spoke, her voice came low. "Who did you bury?" Silas didn't flinch. He just sighed. "I didn't bury anyone," he said. "But I found something out by the north fence." "What?" "A man. Shot once in the gut. Didn't make it. I don't know who he was. I think Beck sent him." She wanted to believe him, but her heart had already begun to build walls against every word. "Then why not tell me?" He looked at her, tired. "Because I knew what it would do to you." Grace stood. "No, you knew what it would do to us. You keep talking about trying to do right, trying to be better, but you don't even give me the truth. Just enough to keep me sitting here, waiting to find out who you really are." He looked like he might argue, then stopped. He nodded once and looked down at his hands, at the blood still under his nails. "You're right." The next morning, he gave her the key to the shed. It was tucked into her palm without a word. She stood outside the door for nearly an hour before she unlocked it. Inside, it smelled of dry hay and metal. There were tools, ropes, tack, and a trunk pushed into the far corner. She opened it slowly. Clara's dress was folded inside, a pale blue cotton thing torn at the shoulder. There were letters too, brittle and yellowing, written in a neat feminine hand. They weren't addressed to Silas. They were for someone named Levi, someone Clara loved, someone she was trying to get back to. The last letter was unfinished. "They think I'm nobody here, but if I could just get to Lark Hill, Levi will be waiting. He promised." I have to believe he meant it. I have to believe it wasn't all for her. The page stopped mid-sentence. Grace sat on the floor and stared at it until her eyes blurred. The rest of the day passed in a haze. She barely noticed the cold creeping into her bones. That night, Silas came to the shed and stood in the doorway. She didn't speak. He said, "Clara wasn't running from a man. She was trying to run to one. She lied to me, told me she had no one. I tried to keep her safe, but all she wanted was to leave. She stole a horse. I never saw her again. Then why keep her things?" He leaned against the frame, quiet. "Because I failed her. I couldn't make her stay. Couldn't keep her from wanting something else. Grace looked at the letters. She didn't want safety. She wanted freedom. Silas's jaw tightened, and that got her killed. You don't know that. I know Beck had people watching my land. I know Harper's name still has weight. Clara might have known something she shouldn't. That's enough. She stood. You want to be the good man, but you still think it's your job to control everything. Even me. He didn't answer, but the truth lay thick between them. The next day, Beck came back. This time, he didn't come alone. 3 men rode behind him, rough, quiet, armed. Grace saw them from the ridge, and her heart dropped. Silas met them in the yard. Grace stood on the porch, arms crossed. Beck dismounted slowly, brushing dust from his coat like he owned the ground. I heard there was trouble out this way, he said. Some stranger found dead up near the fence. I buried him, Silas said. He was shot. Probably yours. Beck smiled. Now, Silas, that's a bold accusation. No bolder than sending men onto my land. Beck tilted his head. You've got something that doesn't belong to you. Silas's shoulders stiffened. What's that? Harper's ledger. The one with all his deals. Every brand he stole. Every name he sold. Grace felt her blood go cold. Beck looked at her. He didn't tell you, huh? She didn't move. That ledger's worth more than gold. More than land. Every man Harper double-crossed wants it. Silas knew that. That's why he stayed behind. Thought he'd dig it out, sell it off, maybe use it to buy a clean slate. Silas didn't deny it. Didn't speak at all. Beck nodded toward the shed. It's in there, ain't it? Grace stared at Silas. Is it? He turned slowly to look at her. Yes. Beck grinned like a wolf. Well then, we've got 2 choices, friend. You hand it over, or we take it, and burn this place to the ground while we're at it. Silas didn't move. Beck's men started forward. Grace stepped down from the porch, heart pounding. Wait. All eyes turned to her. She walked to the shed, opened the door, and pulled the ledger from the trunk. It was wrapped in cloth, bound in cracked leather, thick with names and numbers. She held it in both hands like it was something alive. She looked at Silas. You were going to sell this? He nodded barely. I thought if I used it right, I could wipe the slate. Take the money, start over. Make something new. With me. I hope. She stared at him. You lied. I didn't lie about how I felt, but you lied about everything else. Beck held out his hand. Come on now. Hand it over. Grace looked down at the book. Her fingers clenched tighter. Then she turned and threw into the fire. For a moment, no one moved. Flames roared high, paper curling, blackening. The leather cover split. The names turned to ash. Beck lunged, but Silas was faster. He tackled him, drove a fist into his jaw. One of Beck's men pulled a pistol, but Grace grabbed the iron from beside the stove and swung hard, catching the man across the temple. The fight was short, brutal, messy. When it ended, Beck lay groaning in the dirt, blood in his mouth. His men were disarmed. Silas was bleeding from the temple, but standing. Grace stood over the burning remnants of a ledger. Smoke curled around her, acrid and hot. She looked at Silas. It's over. But it wasn't. That night, they sat on the porch again, wrapped in blankets, sipping coffee. Silence hung heavy, not soft like before. Grace finally said, You were never going to tell me. I didn't know how. You could have just trusted me. I've never known how to do that, either. They sat in silence for a while longer. Then he asked, Will you stay? She shook her head. Not like this. His face fell, but he didn't argue. She left at sunrise. No big goodbye. No promises. Just a note on the table. I need to find out who I am without being someone's second chance. She walked back to town. She found work. She wrote letters, real ones, to people who mattered. She didn't look back for a long time. But sometimes, when the wind blew cold and the stars stretched wide above her, she thought of a man with tired eyes and a broken past, and the life they might have had if either of them had been whole when they met. Somewhere out on that land, the ashes of 100 sins still blew across the grass. But Grace had made a choice. She would not be buried under them. Grace's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. watching the marshal lay out a worn leather wallet filled with documents. He'd called her into the Redstone office just past sundown, and now the world was coming apart at the seams. Her name was on one of the papers. Clara's too. And Silas's real name wasn't even Silas. It was Elias Harper. Not a cousin to the old Harper family, like he claimed. He was a son. The blood in her ears throbbed as the marshal explained it all. Elias Harper had vanished after his father's crimes tore through the territory. Faked his own death, some said. Others believed he'd been killed by one of the ranchers Harper ruined. But here he was, alive, living under a stolen name, running cattle on land bought with secrets and bad money. He lied to you, the marshal said, his voice not unkind. And he's wanted now, dead or alive. Grace didn't cry. She didn't ask for more time. She just stood and left, numb to the wind cutting down Main Street. The sky was heavy with storm clouds by the time she reached the edge of Silas's, no, Elias's property. She walked past the burned remains of the ledger, past the shed where Clara's dress still hung like a ghost on a nail. The house stood quiet, dark and still. Inside, Elias was sitting at the table waiting, as if he knew she'd come. He stood when he saw her, but she raised a hand to stop him. Don't say anything. He sat again, slowly. You know, don't you? I know everything. She closed the door gently and leaned against it, breath shallow. Her voice was low, calm, deadly. You let me believe you were just a man trying to start over. A man with a guilty heart. But it wasn't just guilt, Elias. It was cover. You've been lying since the day we met. He stared at the table, fingers laced together. I didn't come here to keep the Harper name alive. I came to kill it. She laughed once, short, bitter. You got a funny way of doing that. Stealing your father's land, hiding his crimes, trying to sell the very thing that would have exposed all of it. You didn't want justice. You wanted leverage. I wanted a life. You wanted power. That hit him. His jaw clenched. I was 12 when he started making me ride out with him, Elias said. Taught me how to threaten, how to mark cattle, how to clean up after a killing. By the time I was 17, I thought that's all there was. When I finally saw what he'd done to Clara, what he'd done to all those girls, I ran. Changed my name. Tried to forget. And when you found Clara again, he looked haunted. She recognized me. She didn't say anything, but she knew. I think she thought if she stayed close, she could use me to get back to that man. Levi? Grace's stomach twisted. So you kept her here. I tried to protect her. You cage her. He stood furious now. You don't know what it's like to be born into that kind of legacy. To know your blood stains everything it touches. I didn't want her hurt. I didn't want you hurt. Then why keep the ledger? Because the men in that book deserve to burn. Every last one. And I wanted the power to decide how. Grace shook her head. You don't get to play judge. Not when you were part of it. That silence stretched between them, thick and sharp. Finally, she said, the marshal knows. He's coming. Elias didn't move. Then I'll be gone before dawn. I'm not warning you. I'm telling you I won't protect you. He nodded. I never asked you to. But he had. With every lie, with every touch, he had begged her to see him as something better. Something different. She left without another word. That night, the wind howled through the canyons and brought rain, cold and hard. Grace lay awake in the boarding house, staring at the ceiling, her mind churning with everything she'd learned. Elias had been her beginning, her way out of loneliness, out of shame. She had thought she'd found a man willing to build something real, but he had built it all on rotted bones. In the morning, the town buzzed with word of Elias Harper's disappearance. The marshal rode out with 3 men, guns drawn. They found the ranch house empty. But what they didn't find were the ledgers Grace had thought were destroyed, because Elias hadn't burned all of them. He'd hidden the rest in the floorboards of the shed, enough to bring down half the county. And Beck, the man they thought they'd defeated, had come back for them. He and his men raided the property at night, searching, digging. They killed the stable hand, set fire to the barn. Elias had watched it all from a distance. Grace later heard he'd stood at the ridge and didn't move a muscle when the roof caved in. Maybe he thought it was justice. Maybe he thought it was too late to stop any of it. He finally came back into town not to run, but to end it. He turned himself in, ledger in hand, coat soaked with rain. Blood on his lip from a fight she never asked about. Grace was at the general store when he was brought in. She stepped outside, saw the cuffs on his wrists, the way the town folks stared. No one spoke. She followed them to the jailhouse, where he sat on the cot like a man already buried. His eyes lifted when she entered. "You came," he said. "I had to see it with my own eyes." He gave a bitter smile. "I told the marshal everything. Every deal. Every lie. Every death I knew of. There's no going back now." Grace looked at him. "You want redemption, Elias. But you've never done a thing without a motive." He looked away. "Maybe this is the first time I have." She leaned against the bars. "You think telling the truth wipes the slate?" "No, but it's the only way I can stop the men who are still out there. Beck, Levi, the others. I knew what my father did. That makes me part of it. But I'm trying to do one right thing before it all ends." She nodded once. "I hope you mean that." Then she turned and walked away. Outside, people murmured. Some stared. Some spit. The Harper name had returned, and no one would forget it. A week later, Beck was shot dead in a gunfight outside Larkhill. 2 others from the Ledger were arrested. One ran and disappeared into the hills. The land Elias left behind was burned, but not ruined. Grace bought it with the little money she had, claiming it as her own. People said she was foolish, that the soil was cursed, that no good could grow on Harper's land. She didn't care. She rebuilt the barn with help from a Comanche woman she'd once met, who didn't speak much but worked with silent precision. She hired 2 widows who had lost everything in the Harper raids. They planted together, fenced together, cooked, cleaned, and watched the sunrise without fear. Elias's trial was quiet. No jury, no visitors. Grace went once. He looked thinner, older, worn down from the inside out. He didn't speak. She didn't stay long. Before she left, she placed a small paper on the table between them. It was a deed, half the land, in his name. "Not for you," she said, "for what we lost." He looked at her then, something unreadable in his eyes. "You're braver than I ever was," he said. She shrugged. "No, just tired of being lied to." Outside, the rain started again, soft this time. Healing. Everything had unraveled. Trust was gone. Truth had gutted what was left. But Grace had survived. Not because she was the hero, not because she was pure, but because she'd chosen, again and again, not to be destroyed. She had crossed lines, betrayed herself, loved a man who didn't deserve it. But she had learned, and she was still standing. The clouds over Redstone were heavy that morning, low and gray and swollen with the promise of something terrible. Grace stood at the edge of the property, boots sunk deep into wet earth, watching as 3 riders came over the ridge with dust trailing behind them. She knew without asking who they were. Beck was dead, but Levi Kearns wasn't, and the men still loyal to him weren't finished. She turned toward the house. Inside, the women were quiet, tense. Sarah, the younger widow, had her hands wrapped around a rifle like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Esther was in the kitchen, cutting strips of linen for bandages. There hadn't been a word spoken about fleeing. Not this time. This land had been taken, burned, rebuilt, and claimed again by women who had lost too much to run now. Grace nodded once, and that was enough. Everyone knew what was coming. By the time the men rode up the drive, Esther had bolted the doors. Sarah took a spot by the front window. Grace stood just outside, chin high, her coat flapping in the wind. The man at the front was tall, lean, his face lined by old scars and hardy years. Levi Kearns, his eyes fixed on her like he was still trying to size her up. "You got something that don't belong to you," he said. Grace said nothing. He swung down from his horse. The 2 behind him stayed mounted, guns in plain view. Grace didn't flinch. "Ledger," he said simply, "or I'll burn you out like I did your man's family." She narrowed her eyes. "I'm not hiding behind Elias Harper's name." "No," he said, grinning without humor. but you're still standing on his blood." He stepped closer. The smell of tobacco and sweat hit her hard. "Where is it?" "I gave it to the marshal." That was a lie. The last book, Elias's copy of the original, was buried behind a shed, under the stones where Clara had once sat and braided lavender. Grace hadn't told a soul, not even the marshal. Levi studied her face. He wasn't stupid. He'd once bought judges, ruined ranches, and used men like Elias's father as pawns. But this was different. Grace wasn't scared, and that rattled him more than a gun. Without warning, he lunged forward, grabbing her arm. Her knee came up fast, hard into his side. He stumbled back, but one of his men dismounted and fired a warning shot at the ground near her feet. Inside, Sarah returned fire. The bullet cracked through the window and missed the rider by inches. Chaos exploded. Levi shouted for them to back off, but his men had already opened fire. Wood splintered, glass shattered. The front porch lit up with noise and smoke. Grace dove for cover behind the water trough. The world narrowed to heartbeats and dust and heat. Then, screaming, not hers, Sarah was down. A red bloom spread across her shoulder as Esther dragged her back into the kitchen. Grace moved without thinking, crawling low toward the fence where she'd stashed her father's rifle months ago. She got her hands on it and rose just as one of Levi's men circled to the side of the house. She fired. He fell. Levi ducked behind a post, panting, furious. "This didn't have to happen," he shouted. "Yes," Grace said. "It did." The second man turned to run. He didn't get far. A shot from inside, Esther's old, steady hand, dropped him before he reached the horses. It was just Levi now, and Grace. He stepped out with his hands up. "You're not a killer," he said, voice hoarse. "You're just a girl who got her heart broke." She looked at him, thought of the girls whose names were in that ledger. Thought of Clara, silent and scared. Of Elias, kneeling in the dirt, covered in the sins of a father who'd been fed by men like this. Then she pulled the trigger. The shot didn't kill him. She hit him in the leg, just above the knee. He went down screaming, clutching the wound, cursing her with every filthy name he knew. By the time the dust settled, Grace stood over him, the rifle aimed steady. "You're right," she said quietly. "I'm not a killer." Then she lowered the rifle and turned her back on him. When the marshal came, he found Levi bleeding in the dirt, his men dead, and Grace in the kitchen helping Esther wrap bandages around Sarah's arm. He didn't ask questions. Didn't need to. The next few days were a blur of noise, visitors, rumors. Some said Grace had become like Elias, violent, dangerous. Others called her a hero. Most just stared when she walked by, unsure if they should tip their hats or cross to the other side of the street. But the truth didn't care what they believed. She buried the last ledger herself, not in the ground, but in fire. She burned it behind the shed, watching every name curl into ash, because that story was done. But her choices weren't. That night, a letter arrived from the jail. Elias had written her a single page. His handwriting was rough, like it had been scrawled in the dark. "Grace, I heard what happened. Levi always underestimated you. I did too. The judge gave me 10 years. Said I'd served in the East, away from Redstone. Maybe that's mercy. Maybe not. I'm not asking for anything. Just wanted you to know I think about the morning you walked into that boarding house more than I think about anything else. I lied too much. Hurt you more than I ever meant to. But if you ever find peace, I hope you find it with someone who earns it. And if you ever plant peach trees on that land, name one after Clara. She deserved better." Grace folded the letter and placed it in the drawer under the flower bin. She didn't cry, but something shifted in her chest, low and deep and aching. She stood on the porch that night, lantern in hand, watching the moon rise over the hills. This was the climax of everything. The lies, the blood, the weight of secrets no longer buried. Grace had made a choice, not just to fight, but to live differently. It had cost her her innocence, her trust, and nearly her life. But she was still standing, and in the soil she now called home, spring would come. Maybe peaches would bloom one day, Maybe laughter would return to the kitchen. Maybe Sarah would heal, and Esther would sing again. Maybe peace wasn't a place. Maybe it was just the choice to stop running. The wind settled in Redstone, not all at once, but slowly, like the town had exhaled after holding its breath too long. A month passed since the shootout, and the land began to soften. Green crept up through the blackened soil around the barn. The new fence post stood straight, topped with fresh wire. The ranch lived. Not just survived, but lived. Grace moved through her days with steady hands. She didn't speak much of what had happened. When people came by offering to help or trade, she nodded, thanked them, but made no room for long visits. Redstone's folks had a short memory for mercy and a long one for scandal, and Grace had lived too close to both. Some respected her more now. Others whispered behind her back, using words like tainted or cursed. She let them. She'd been worse things. Sarah's wound healed slower than expected, but she was up and walking by late April, her laugh returning like it was something being unburied. Esther refused to leave, even when her daughter from Abilene sent a letter begging her to come home. Home's not always where you started, she'd said, and Grace had felt that sentence live in her bones. Elias was gone, transported east to serve his sentence in a prison built from stone and silence. She received one more letter. It was shorter than the first. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope you started sleeping through the night again. She hadn't, but the dreams weren't always of blood and fire anymore. Sometimes she dreamed of Clara, smiling. Sometimes of Elias, younger, softer, with none of the weight in his eyes. Dreams had a cruel way of showing what might have been, just enough to haunt. Levi Kearns survived the bullet. He lost his leg to infection, and with it, any power he still held. His trial was public, brutal, and humiliating. Names were named, deals exposed. The other men who'd worked under the Harper name were hunted, one by one, until there was no one left to deny what had happened. Clara's story, once buried, was finally told in full. She wasn't there to see it, but Grace spoke her name every time someone tried to forget. The ranch turned a small profit that spring, enough to buy 2 new calves and repair the windmill. It wasn't much, but it was honest. Grace looked out at the fields some mornings and felt a kind of stillness she'd never known as a girl, never thought she'd earn. Peace wasn't perfect, but it came in pieces. One warm morning, Esther brought in a package wrapped in brown paper and string. There was no return address, just her name in a familiar scrawl. Grace opened it slowly. Inside was a single peach pit, dried and smooth, wrapped in cotton. Beneath it, a note. For Clara, the first tree should be hers. She didn't smile, but she didn't cry either. That afternoon, she dug a small hole by the eastern fence line, just where the light hit longest before dusk. She planted the pit with careful fingers, then stood there for a long time, watching the sky. Years would pass before that tree would bear fruit, if it ever did. But she didn't need proof. She'd made her choice. Harsh, unforgiving, costly, and she had lived with it. Not just survived it, lived with it. That was redemption enough. Redstone moved on. People married. Children were born. A new preacher came and didn't ask about the old one. The town repainted the church and planted roses by the schoolhouse. The past was never far, but it stopped ruling the present. Grace, in time, started writing letters again. Not to Elias, but to other women, names from Clara's notes scattered across the territory. She didn't ask them to forgive. She just told them what had happened, what had been uncovered, what had been done. Some wrote back. One sent a drawing of a woman on horseback, with wild hair and a crooked smile. Underneath, it were the words, "We survive each other's silence." Not anymore. In the end, Grace didn't marry again. Not out of bitterness, just truth. She had loved once blindly, then again fully, and both had broken her, but neither had ruined her. What ruined men like Elias's father and Levi and Beck was the belief that pain could be hidden, that would rot quietly underground. But pain doesn't stay buried. It grows roots, demands light, find its way out, sometimes through violence, sometimes through women like Grace, and sometimes through a single peach tree planted in soil that once knew blood but now knew hope.